Shalom TV's coverage of the 10th anniversary Limmud conference is made possible in part by a grant from Dr. Naomi Vilko, in honor of her mother, Olga Vilko, and in memory of her father, William Vilko.
So, welcome to Thinking and Talking About Shabbat. And I want to offer you a frame today for understanding one particular text, a passage in the Mechilta, which we'll talk about in a minute, really as a window into thinking about some of our different vocabularies around Shabbat and how we can do two things. I think one, understand in certain ways what different Jews are motivated by when they think about what Shabbat is about and where those motivations actually come from as anchored in our tradition. And also in modeling ultimately what I'm going to claim to you as the distinctive rabbinic take on what Shabbat is about, to push ourselves and stretch ourselves to incorporate the fullness of that model. I think many of us actually often operate with partial models of Shabbat that are not actually the full expression of what the rabbinic vision of Shabbat actually calls upon us to live up to. So we're going to start with the first source on this page. There is a line that most of us, many of us, begin our observance of Shabbat every week with, and it comes from Lecha Dodi. And it's the very first stanza of Lecha Dodi. Shamor v'Zakhor b'dibur echad hishmianu el hamiyuchad. God informed us and spoke to us, Shamor and Zakhor, in one utterance. A single utterance by God contained both Shamor and Zakhor. And this, of course, is referring to, we'll look at it in greater depth in a minute, referring to the two formulations of the Ten Commandments as they appear in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. And in Exodus it begins, as the Shabbat morning Kiddush uses that text as well, Zakhor et Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho, literally remember or mention or make known the Shabbat day in order to sanctify it. As opposed to in Dvarim, in the last book of the Torah, it says Shamor et Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho ka'asher tzivcha Adonai Elohecha. Guard, protect, observe the Shabbat day as God has commanded you. Now, I don't know how many of you had the same experience, but when I was growing up, the way I understood this to what I was taught basically that this meant is that the Jewish people standing at Mount Sinai heard some sound that sounded something like Sham Zakhor. Okay? Some sort of synthesis, which if we really had a stereo system, for some future version of this, I actually want to kind of get one speaker playing one and the other playing the other and play it simultaneously over and over and over. It's one vision of what's going on here. But I want to suggest to you that actually the Mechilta, the early midrash on Shmot, on the book of Exodus, that reflects the source of this rabbinic, of this poetic statement, actually clearly does not mean that, and means something entirely different, and will give us another window onto not just what the midrash is, but how the rabbinic sages thought about what Shabbat, not just sort of how it's described in the Torah, but what it should mean for us. So let's begin on the first source here, okay? Okay, so we're beginning with the Mechilta here, the first source. And we have here in the very first line, Zakhor v'Shamor shnehem ne'emru b'dibur echad. Zakhor and Shamor were said both in one utterance. Okay, and that could on its own be read as what I just said, this sort of stereophonic combination of two different things. Well, it was the same event, wasn't it? The Ten Commandments, so it must be the two formulations were said at the same time. But when you continue in the Mechilta, you realize that's not at all what's going on with any of the other examples. Continues. Here we have a different statement, which is that the Torah says, actually in what we just read this past Shabbat, those who desecrate it shall be put to death. And yet the Torah also says, on the Shabbat day, you must offer up 2 lambs as a special offering on the altar in the temple. What's the issue there? those two statements are in conflict, because the act of slaughtering an animal and of burning it in fire is a core violation of Shabbat. And yet the Torah also tells you that a core violation of Shabbat is punishable by death. How can it be that the Torah says both these things? Because it says both of them at once. Now here already it should be very clear. This is not a statement of two different linguistic formulations of the same idea. These are two conflicting ideas, two conflicting mitzvot. One which forbids the desecration of Shabbat, and the other which requires its violation in the context of the temple. Continue on. In one case, the Torah says it is forbidden in a core way, punishable by death, for a man to be intimate with his brother's wife. And yet in another place, in the context of articulating the commandment to engage in levirate marriage, the idea that when a brother dies childless, there is an obligation, later a license, later a prohibition to actually carry it out, but an expectation in the Torah that actually the brother of the deceased must marry the wife of the deceased. And how can it be, says the Midrash, that both of these hold? Shnehem ne'emru b'dibur echad. God said both of them at the same time. In a way, one is carved out from the other, and they are both competing but nonetheless coexisting mitzvot. Lo tilbash sha'adnez ugdilim ta'aseh lecha. Shnehem ne'emru b'dibur echad. The Torah forbids the wearing of shatnez, the mixing of wool and linen, and yet it states in a blanket way that one is supposed to have woolen cords on one's clothing, the tzitzit, applying, understood rabbinically, even to a linen garment. Right? Even a linen garment is supposed to have a woolen cord on the end of it. How can that be? Two conflicting mitzvot were both said at the same time. Ma she'i afshar le'adam lomar kein, shene'emar achat diber Elohim, shtayim zu shamanu, ve'omer halo kol dvari ka'esh ne'um Hashem. This dual articulation, says the Midrash at the end, in all of these cases, is something that a human being could not do. Not meaning a human being cannot utter two different sounds at the same time, which is also true, but clearly meaning a human being who would say one thing and its opposite would be dismissed as incoherent. God's word, however, and we see this here from the final parable, is not taken when it says two different things as being incoherent, but being seen as an anvil that smashes onto another metal surface as sending off sparks in different directions. There's a multivocality when God speaks that would otherwise be incoherent in the voice of a human being. That's the idea here that runs throughout this Midrash. And what it makes us realize is if we really want to understand Zakhor v'Shamor, Shnehem ne'emru b'dibur echad, we must understand that similar to the other cases, which is it's not about two different sounds of two different words. There's actually something conflicting about Zakhor and Shamor. This text is opaque as to what that is, but if it's to be in line with all the other examples, the Torah apparently tells us Zakhor in spite of Shamor, and Shamor in spite of Zakhor. What I want to spend the rest of our time now is unpacking what I think is the plain sense of this Midrash. What is the conflict between Zakhor and Shamor, not on a linguistic, but on a conceptual level? And how does the rabbinic synthesis of those two tell us what it means for us to observe Shabbat? So what I want to suggest here, and I want to put it straight and right off the bat here, make it clear, and we'll then see it kind of inside. I don't think the words Zakhor and Shamor here are actually referring to themselves. I think they are referring to the entire paragraph that describes Shabbat in the respective places in Exodus and Deuteronomy. That is a shorthand, because you're not going to rattle off 3 sentences, for saying the paragraph in Parshat Yitro and the paragraph in Parshat Va'etchanan, nonetheless, despite the fact that they conflict, were both said by God. And let's understand what is going on there. If you look at the Torah, you actually find there are 2 totally different reasons given for keeping Shabbat. embedded in a shared language of the expectation of not doing melacha, not performing work, certain kinds of creative labor. There are nonetheless two conflicting descriptions and models. Someone volunteer, please, to give us the first model, which will begin with a passage from Shmot, and we'll then continue with the Ten Commandments in Dvarim and Deuteronomy. Can I have someone read in the English, page 1, the last two sources on the page?
6 days thou shalt do thy work, but on the 7th day thou shalt rest, that thine ox and thine ass may have rest, and the son of thy handmaid and the stranger may be refreshed. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord thy God commanded thee. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath unto the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any manner of work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thine ox, nor thine ass, nor any of thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates, that thy manservant and thy maidservant may rest as well as thou. And thou shalt remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt, and the Lord thy God brought thee out hence by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord thy God commanded thee to keep the Sabbath day.
Okay, let's reflect on this model for a minute. What is the reason given for observing Shabbat in this paradigm? What's the motivation? God brought us out from Egypt is sort of the trigger for why we do it. And can you expand even further? How does that lead us to the observance of Shabbat? There's one reading is that it's essentially we owe a life debt, as it were, to God, and therefore God can ask what God wants of us. And I want to push us to not just see it as God did something for us, so we must do something for God. I actually think the appeal to V'zacharta ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim, remember that you were a slave in Egypt, is more directly related to what Shabbat is supposed to be about, according to this articulation. We who were slaves, who suffered under a culture of 24/7 work and expectation and economic servitude, we now understand what that is and how terrible it is, and therefore Shabbat is for us to be agents in the world of making sure that at least in the part of the world we control, we do not enslave ourselves and we do not enslave those who are under our control. The motivation here is very clear. It is about a certain social vision of what the world is supposed to look like. You could even maybe use the word social justice, of a vision of a world that, informed by a past experience with slavery, never allows itself to economically enslave other people or itself. All right, now I want you to play out for a minute. If you were, based on this passage alone, to interpret the opaque biblical term milacha, that which you may not do on Shabbat, work, labor, whatever it is, I don't want to translate it, milacha, which you can't do on Shabbat, if you were motivated by this articulation of the basis for Shabbat, what would you describe, what do you think that practice would look like? What do you think would be forbidden? What would be permitted? What would be mandated? Let's formulate it sort of in the negative, and then we can come to some of the positive. You would say, you should not do things that make you feel like a slave, right? Several times, my kids are already, thank God, older than this age, but several Shabbatot in my life where my kids were younger, and I was hauling some baby stroller up some back gray-painted staircase up to the 10th floor of some building where I'm having Shabbat lunch, and my wife will turn to me and say, day of rest, here we are, on the day of rest, right? The sarcasm behind that comment is drawing on Dvarim, which is to say, hey, I thought this was supposed to be a day where I don't feel like a slave. So we would expect in the negative formulation that there would be things that are basically a burden that we don't do. And we might then translate that in a positive formulation to, I would say, the seeking out of oneg, of pleasure, the things that make us feel free. The things that make us feel like we can enjoy ourselves. What else? What else, according to this model, might you put in or not put in?
I'm not sure this is what he intended, but it says ma'asecha, which I think has to do with asiyah, and therefore has to do with hands. So anything that you can create with your hands, but not intellectually, which is the reason that you can probably brainstorm and do anything else that you can create, but you can't create with your hands.
Okay, good. So definitely in both, we'll see the other formulation. The notion of melacha and creating with one's hands is very central here. Part of what I want us to sort of define even more sharply is Fine, but what do you think they mean? And how would that be refracted through the motivation that's given? And here I would suggest to you, right, the normal thing, if I were to look at, well, don't do what you do with your hands, juxtaposed with not being a slave, remembering that you were a slave, I would think some version of the things that slaves do. The things that are burdensome, difficult work. I might even expand it beyond, if we want to go sort of beyond just the physical burden level. It would seem actually the biggest cardinal sin, violation of Shabbat you could do according to Dvarim in our world would be to go into the office. Right? That's what it would be. Forget you driving in a car to a national park. Like, well, that has nothing to do with anything, right? In a way, right, the kind of Shabbat that many secular Israelis observe, okay, which is to say, not necessarily focusing on this particular action, but don't work on that day, right? That's very much in keeping with Dvarim's articulation of what this is about. And by the way, there's other details we're not even going to fully get into here, but just to sort of get you thinking in this mode. If I were to say to you, is it so obvious what day of the week it must be that we observe a day off according to Dvarim? No. It's 1 in every 7, but that seems to be like all that matters, right? In other words, let's say you were like, well, no, in this context it seems like Sunday is going to do just as much of a job. There's nothing in Dvarim on its own, read in isolation, that would particularly point you away from that. Because at the end of the day, it's about make sure you don't enslave people 24/7. Okay, that's going to be very different from what we're going to see now. So now let's look at the other place where we see this spoken about. So someone want to give the other version of the Ten Commandments and then the brief passage from Breshit. Two very, very familiar passages. Yes?
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath unto the Lord thy God. In it shalt thou not do any manner of work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gate.
That's identical so far to what we saw in Dvarim, a few minor changes. Now, different.
For in the 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested on the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. And the heaven and the earth were finished, and all the hosts of them. And on the 7th day God finished his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the 7th day and hallowed it, because that in it he rested from all his work which God in creating had made.
Okay, let's now play out the same experiment here. If you had only this passage, what would you say defines melacha? What are the things you would feel you would positively have an imperative to do on Shabbat? Only with this in mind. Now define melacha again. With this motivation.
Avoiding creation.
Avoiding creation. Okay, great. So here, once we talk about God stepping back from the world, right? Once we talk about that, we are in some senses imitating that, and we are appealing to that. We then potentially have a whole set of actions with our hands that now might have nothing to do with work or being a slave or being overly burdened, but which nonetheless are dramatically transformative of the world. Okay? To take a match and to strike it, where the phosphorus is already there and there's no effort that has to be put in. It's very hard to imagine you getting worked up about that based on Dvarim alone. And on the other hand, the notion of that being anywhere compatible with a vision of God stopped creating on the 7th day and I'm trying to be like God in the context of this practice, it's unimaginable how that fits in terms of it being a dramatically creative act, okay? This also comes about in terms of how you see the reference point, right? The reference point to Shabbat in the Ten Commandments, in Deuteronomy, one of the things that's very striking is it emerges out of history and out of Israelite experience and suffering, and is in that sense a response to a social reality to which it is countercultural. This version of Shabbat is outside of history. Before there was ever a society at all, there was a God who rested on Shabbat. And therefore, the practice of melacha is not going to be defined by the conventional uses of physical power in human society. It's going to be defined by our understanding of what is the natural world and what does it mean to manipulate it. Okay? By contrast, in terms of how about the positive piece, can I invite anyone to say, if the first model would lead you to seek oneg, seek pleasure, the ways in which you feel free, what would you seek to do according to the Zakhor model? One way, in a negative way, would be to refrain from doing any of the creative work that God refrains from, but also you would want to seek out God, right? You would not sit around and play Settlers of Catan. In other words, the idea actually of sitting around in a way of just having a great time with your friends, as opposed to connecting deeply with the creator of the universe. I don't know who your friends are. Those don't always go hand in hand, okay? And that's, in the positive sense, part of what I want you to feel. You should now be starting to get an instinctive feeling for Zakhor v'Shamor b'dibur echad ne'emru. These, if Zakhor stands for the Zakhor model of because God created the world in 6 days, and Shamor stands for the Shamor model of because you were taken out from Egypt, those are not always so easy to do together, both in terms of their positive formulation, but also I think we see now, going back to my day of rest story, hauling the stroller up the stairs, that felt like a moment where we were not sort of fulfilling day of rest, day of enjoyment, actually in an incredibly deep way. That was a very deep spiritual fulfillment of what it is to respect God's creation. Right? To the extent, itself, it's a whole other halachic discussion whether one should think an elevator is so bad to go into on Shabbat, but to the extent that one experiences engaging with a combination of the buttons and the whole sort of mechanical apparatus around it, that actually that represents entering into a space that is all about humanity's manipulation of the world, that trek up the stairs, while perhaps not restful and sweat-inducing, is in another way deeply consciousness-raising about, yes, this is a day where I deal with the world as it is, and I don't try to change it. But there's actually a conflict there, and you can't really do both of them fully at the same time, just like you can't do all the other things in the Mechilta fully at the same time. And yet this text tells us, b'dibur echad ne'emru. God somehow expects you to actually do both of these. Okay, couple of comments, questions, then we're going to move on. Okay, great. So the comment is pointing out it's actually two things I want to draw out. One is the notion of vayanach implies that if I'm now resting, that I worked before, and actually evoking the idea of God creating the world in 6 days and resting also pushes us to be creative those other 6 days, and to see that as that's sort of the foundation on which we build the palace of Shabbat in some way. The other thing you pointed to, which I think is really important here that I don't want to get lost, is the much more intensive use in the Zakhor model of the root kuf dalid shin of Shabbat being holy and sacred. There's a stray reference to that in Dvarim, but I'm not sure at all you would really pick up on it or think based on the Shamor model that Shabbat is anything more than an enforced furlough from work, which is not about being sacred, it's a day off. Talking about the day as being blessed and being sacred only reinforces this is a model that is doing much more work in the human-divine relationship in a way that the Shamor model is actually much more about God saying, I want you on the human plane to create a certain kind of society that's going to be less slave-like, less slavery-induced. But I want to now move to give you a sense with a little bit of the historical background of how this was actually a distinctive way of thinking about Shabbat at the time that the Mechilta was formulated, and it was not the only way that Jews thought about it. And by being committed to both the Zakhor and the Shamor models simultaneously, you could already tell as a close reader of text that there might well have been factions that held the Zakhor model to be supreme, and factions that held the Shamor model to be supreme. But I'm now going to actually show you those people and see what it is the rabbinic model is responding to. So let's begin with a few texts that I think actually play out for us what it would look like to actually take Zakhor. Ki sheishet yamim asa Hashem et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. God created the world in 6 days very, very seriously. Josephus, in a passage in one of his works against Appian, it's a sort of counter-anti-Semitic text trying to kind of defend and explain the ways of the Jews, has the following comment. It says, there are people called Jews and dwell in a city, the strongest of all other cities, which the inhabitants call Jerusalem, and are accustomed to rest on every seventh day, on which time they make no use of their arms, nor meddle with husbandry, nor take care of any affairs of life. They don't do melacha, but spread out their hands in the holy places and pray till the evening. You thought your shul was long, okay? This is Yom Kippur every week, okay? But I want you to understand how that's actually a total normal way that someone really listening to the Zakhor model would say, here's how I should be spending my time. I should be spending my time seeking out God. So what am I going to do all day? I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray all day to try to connect with God. Maybe you'd sing, maybe you'd do other things, but this is what you would be pursuing. And Josephus here actually gives us a testimony of this being a common Jewish practice. It's not just there's those 10 weirdos who do that. That actually a lot of people are spending their Shabbat almost entirely in this kind of prayer mode. For a more kind of extreme version of this on the melacha level, look what we find in one of the passages from the Dead Sea Scrolls. But should any man fall into water or fire, let him not be pulled out with the aid of a ladder or rope or some such utensil. Now, many of you are familiar with the principle in rabbinic law of pikuach nefesh doche Shabbat, that saving a life supersedes Shabbat. This was not a universally agreed upon principle. Okay? And actually, if you think about it, it's not so obvious a principle. Because what's the punishment for violating Shabbat? The death penalty. What good does it do to save someone's life in order to violate Shabbat in order to save someone's life when that violation is itself a capital offense? Of course, the rabbis said, no, it's different. Someone who you're saving their life, we think about it differently. But it's not totally self-evident that that's how one should read the Torah. Maybe Shabbat is a value that one is expected to martyr oneself for. Okay? But putting that aside, even though that's a big thing to put aside, and it's a core part of this text, but I want you to see what is the text so allergic to that it doesn't allow you to do on Shabbat. It obviously assumes you don't violate Shabbat to save a life, but what's the violation here? Using a utensil. It's not even a milacha. This is not even what rabbinically would be considered to be an act. We're talking about lowering a ladder. But what's the problem with a ladder? A ladder, like any other utensil that is fashioned by human beings, is the ultimate sign of how human beings control their environment and how they make things, how they take things like trees and turn them into ladders. Kelim, utensils, are actually the ultimate marker on some level of human civilization. Right? Even today, when we're charting out the evolutionary tree, the point where tools are introduced, the opposable thumb, right? This is actually the moment at which we switch, in a certain sense, from being one kind of animal to another, defined largely by how we dominate our natural environment. Again, how much you're comfortable, as the rabbinic sources were not, with actually letting someone die in the name of Shabbat, I want you to hear the ways in which the Zakhor model here, in a very scary and powerful way, really says, you have no business picking up a tool on Shabbat. That is not the way you are supposed to be engaging on this day. Okay? Now, Jubilees is a lengthy text, which I don't want to spend too much time because I want to make sure we get to the other things here. But if you read it through, this is a text also, non-rabbinic source, Second Temple period, which has a whole list of Shabbat practices, and among them are all kinds of restrictions that sound very foreign to the rabbinic ear, the rabbinically affected ear, but which nonetheless, again, if you put yourself in a Zakhor mentality, make perfect sense. For instance, among them, a prohibition on sexual intimacy on Shabbat. Oh God, for rabbinic Jews, that's part of the oneg. That's part of the sort of pleasure-building component of Shabbat. And yet think about it for a moment. What does it mean on a day that is about refraining from creation to engage in the ultimate creative human act? What does it mean to engage in the ultimate, most intense interpersonal act that human beings are capable of on a day when you're supposed to be connecting with God and be like God? right? Someone who is really only hearing the Zakhor voice is totally reasonably going to arrive at that conclusion. And you can see any number of other aspects of this Jubilees passage that very much play that out. All right? So I want you can be a little unsettled by it, but I want you to feel the power and actually imagine Jews around you living this way. As someone in the time of the Mechilta, to imagine that the Zakhor model, Ki sheshet yamim asa Hashem et hashamayim v'et haaretz, at the end of the day, it's also the creation story that the whole Torah starts with, is one in which God refrained from melacha on the seventh day. What am I going to do if not try to be like God? Okay? And there's something actually very, very powerful about that. We'll come back to the ways in which rabbinic practice really retains that and in certain ways even amplifies it. Okay, that's the end of that model. I want now to turn to a source that reflects Jews who ended up becoming not Jews, which is a few passages from the Christian Bible, which will show you what the Shamor voice looks like if held more seriously in isolation.
And it came to pass that he was going on the Sabbath day through the grain fields, and his disciples began as they went to pluck the ear. And the Pharisees said unto him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? And he said unto them, Did you never read what David did when he had meat and was hungry, he and they that were with him? How he entered into the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the showbread, which it is not lawful to eat save for the priests, and gave also to them that were with him. And he said unto them, This Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath, so that the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And he entered again into the synagogue, and there was a man there who had his hand withered. And they watched him, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. And he said unto the man that had his hand withered, Stand forth. And he said unto them, Is it lawful on the Sabbath day to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to kill? But they held their peace. And when he had looked round about on them with anger, being grieved at the hardening of their heart, he said unto the man, Stretch forth thy hand. And he stretched it forth, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out, and straightway with the Herodians to counsel against him how they might destroy him. And a certain man was there who had been 38 years in his infirmity. When Jesus saw him lying and knew that he had been now a long time in that case, he said unto him, Wouldst thou be made whole? The sick man answered him, Sir, I have no man, when the water is troubled, to put me into the pool. But while I am coming, another steps down before me. Jesus said unto him, Arise, take up thy bed, and walk. And straightway the man was made whole, and took up his bed, and walked. Now it was the Sabbath on that day. So the Jews said unto him that was cured, It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for thee to take up thy bed. But he answered them, He that made me whole, the same said unto me, Take up thy bed. Jesus answered and said unto them, I did one work, and ye all marvel because thereof. Moses hath given you circumcision. Not that it is of Moses, but of the fathers. And on the Sabbath he circumcised a man. If a man receiveth circumcision on the Sabbath, and the law of Moses may not be broken, are ye wroth with me because I began every whit whole on the Sabbath? Judge not according to appearance, but judge righteous judgment.
Okay, we'll come back to that final line, judge righteous judgment, which I think is important for understanding what's going on. But let's understand the dialogue here between the Pharisees and Jesus. And I want you to appreciate, because it's the only way you can really appreciate what Chazal are doing here and where we stand in this as Jews coming out on the other end of this. You have to understand that this is an internal Jewish debate. This is not a debate between Jews and Christians. This is a debate between Jews, which ends up producing a position that drifts away from Judaism. But let's understand first what the Pharisees are saying. The Pharisees are saying the things that those of us who are familiar with rabbinic law recognize, and at least however we think about them philosophically, are sort of comfortable with as the way Shabbat is traditionally thought about Jewishly in our discourse. Which is to say, well, you're not allowed to pluck a thing that's growing out of the ground to eat it on Shabbat. That's a forbidden action, okay? You are not allowed, this one a little less familiar to some of us, but I want you to hear also the sort of Zakhor overtones here. You don't necessarily heal someone on Shabbat. All right? This maintains, we'll come back to this in rabbinic law much later, even putting aside the case of someone's life being in danger, where you might intervene, but someone whose life is not in danger, Why would you not heal on Shabbat? Certainly according to the Zakhor paradigm, healing, again, is actually one of the main human interventions in the world against the natural course of events to reverse the process that God has put into motion. So an allergy to healing is understandable in that model. And then even here at the end, we seem to have some notion here that's comparable to hotza'ah, the act of taking things from one place to another, carrying from a private to a public place, or in the public domain on Shabbat, when the man in the passage from John is picking up his bed and the Pharisees come and chide him. All right? Now I want you to understand, the wrong way to read this passage is to say, yeah, this is a typical example of early Christian Jesus-influenced antinomianism coming to find a way to break Jewish laws in the name of kind of arrogating power to this one man and his sect, right? It's a complete misreading, both in terms of the broader background and also in terms of the language that's employed, which is the language of internal polemic and argumentation. It's not so different from the way the Mishnah sounds in various places. I'll give you a proof from circumcision that what I'm doing is okay. Okay? And here's where you have to understand that actually, imagine for a moment that you were back in the world of the Shamor paradigm. It would be totally reasonable that you would say the following things. God told me that the purpose of this day is that we have to remember we were slaves and not subject ourselves to that kind of oppression. And that's what Shabbat is all about. I understand, and I think Jesus would have completely stood by this, that it's a violation of the biblical Sabbath to plow your field and to harvest it. But if I'm just walking through and I'm hungry, why would I not be allowed to pick something off the tree? Actually, I think if you were relying on the Shamor paradigm alone, you would never imagine that was forbidden. If there was no narrative of, well, God created the world, etc., it's just have a day of rest, you would say you're not allowed to go and harvest the field, but of course an ad hoc plucking that is in order to make you not feel starving and miserable on Shabbat is what God wants you to do. Similarly, healing, as much as it makes sense in the Zakhor paradigm, is as little as it makes sense to have a ban on that in the Shamor paradigm. You're going to let someone be miserable and suffer on Shabbat when you have the ability to take someone who's lame and enable them to walk? Jesus essentially is saying from within a Jewish reading of the Torah, a non-rabbinic reading, as we'll see, but a Jewish reading of the Torah saying, what are you, crazy? You're essentially violating what the Torah told you in Dvarim. You're listening so exclusively to this other piece, you are not paying attention to this element. I would even say it's stronger. I think that's actually the only element he is hearing or paying attention to. And where you see that is actually, I think, this notion at the end that this is sort of like common sense, that this is what any decent person would do. Judge not according to appearance, but judge righteous judgment. Come on. Have some seichel, think about this. What's the right kind of atmosphere we're trying to create on Shabbat? Surely people shouldn't be suffering. So jump forward, page 4. In the middle of the page, the Mechilta. Ushmartem et ha-Shabbat. You must observe Shabbat. Zehu shaya Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya omer, lachem Shabbat mesura, ve'iatem mesurim le-Shabbat. You are not handed over to the Sabbath is handed over to you. That is verbatim, basically, Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, Jesus. Meaning what? Jesus is not making this up out of whole cloth as a antinomian statement. This is a thing Jews are saying. What's the difference? In Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, what does this, is this an attempt to ground? Pikuach nefesh. The idea that you save a life of someone who will die is used, this phrase is used to kind of ground that law, but not that you're hungry and walking through the field and you want to pick it. All right, now just to sort of show you, I'll tell you one story I happen to be present for, which I think so illustrates how these paradigms continue to kind of challenge each other today, and then I want to move to kind of how I understand the rabbinic synthesis of this. So I was once in a situation on Shabbat. It was a grandmother and her grandson. Grandmother was not someone who had any kind of restrictions around Shabbat in any negative way, maybe had some vague sense of the value of this was the Jew's idea of a day off, but mostly I would say was an American Jew who thought of like, yeah, I have my weekends and that's where I recharge, and didn't have any kind of ritual frame around how you think about Shabbat, and operated in a community that in no way challenged that assumption and in many ways kind of reinforced it. Sitting with her grandson, who had grown up in a home where there was an expectation of rabbinic laws around Shabbat and how they would be enforced. And this was in Arizona in the winter. And she had a grapefruit tree in her backyard, and it was Shabbat afternoon. And she said to him, can you go outside and pick me one of those grapefruits? And he said, I can't because it's Shabbat. And she said, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. That's not work. Okay? That's not work. Now, I want to get you to understand what was going on in this exchange, both like kind of redeem it in a sense from both sides. The grandmother was actually intuitively in that moment thinking like a Shamor paradigm influenced person. Which is to say, had she said, I have full confidence, has she said to him, I need you to come into the office today to do a bunch of things. And he had said, I don't do that, I don't work on Saturday, there would have been no quibbling at all. But the notion that, like it was for Jesus, right? The notion that, I'm not comparing the two, okay? But the notion that your restriction around Shabbat would extend to any individual isolated act of putting a fruit off a tree was incomprehensible to her, because what did melacha mean? Melacha meant the kind of melacha you would derive from reading Dvarim and the Shamor paradigm, okay? Whereas for the boy, I don't think he was able to articulate this, but he had been raised in an environment, it might have been very helpful to him that he had this language to articulate it. They were completely having a conversation of two people not listening to each other, because he had been raised in an environment that said, well, actually, Kisheshet Yamim is another piece of what it means to observe Shabbat. And yeah, I don't go to the office, but also the individual act of plucking the grapefruit off the tree is actually interfacing with God's creation in a way I don't do. And actually, if I did that, it would be breaking that whole dimension of what I'm trying to accomplish on Shabbat. But because they had no shared vocabulary to like talk that through or around, it was just a moment of unpleasant conflict. Okay? But in fact, what was playing out there are the ways in which Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad ne'emru, these do not go so easily together always. And the rabbinic commitment, which we're now going to talk about, to holding them both together is not because they simply just add up to a harmonious whole, but despite our awareness that actually the Torah is incredibly powerful here if you think about it. It lays in front of us a challenge to fulfill the same mandate while looking through one lens on our left eye and another lens on our right eye, and as opposed to just coming out cross-eyed to see something in stereo vision. And that's actually very hard to do, but is the essence of the entire project. All right? Now, if you start to sort of play this out, one of the things that for me has been extremely helpful about this model of thinking about it is then all sorts of aspects of the rabbinic balancing around Shabbat begin to make sense and to fall into place. And you can also understand why certain debates erupt where they do. So for instance, you can start to find where are all the places where the Shamor model actually plays out. Actually, the notion of Oneg Shabbat is not just a kind of narrative thing that Jews talk about around Shabbat. It also has halachic consequences. There are things that a person is not supposed to do on Shabbat if they will aggravate you. Right? I mean, there's a lot of people who don't read newspapers at all on Shabbat. Or they certainly don't read the business section. Or they don't read whatever things basically are going to get them agitated. Okay? And the idea there that Oneg actually channels what I should focus on is very present. It's even present in rabbinic sources around sometimes overriding things that are somewhat problematic, but that you're allowed to do for the sake of Oneg, but only things that are maximally of a rabbinic level of prohibition, which is where we'll get to the Zakhor model weighing in a second. But the idea, for instance, that no, it's not appropriate to spend all of Shabbat day rearranging all of your folding furniture in your house from the attic to the basement and vice versa. But if guests are coming over, then it's okay to do that. In other words, the same activity, which fundamentally is basically a burden and something that's taking you away from relaxation and enjoyment, if done in the pursuit of enjoyment, is permissible from a halachic rabbinic normative perspective. Okay? But you then also feel the balance, which is to say, rabbinic sources say, yeah, but the second you start behaving like Jesus, you've lost Zakhor. You might be being really frum on Shamor, but you've actually lost this other piece, which despite the fact that you're going to sweat going up 10 flights of stairs, actually we also want you to get. We want you to have a practice that is going to make you hyper-conscious of, I didn't create this world, someone else created it, and that a major check on human beings in this world is that sometimes they have to just stop. And they have to find a way to stop and not come up with all the ways to justify keep going. That's one place where it's balanced. You already see a window here also into pikuach nefesh. The idea that the Shamor model, in fact, is invoked, because I would say to you the whole notion of pikuach nefesh, of saving lives, does not emerge from the Zakhor model. It emerges from Shamor. Based on the Zakhor model of you're imitating God, you're doing what God wants, etc., I think you probably, with that alone unchecked, would end up with Shabbat being one of the things you martyr yourself for, rather than do it. And there's actually even traces in rabbinic literature of that idea, that Shabbat, someone says, you have to violate Shabbat or I'm going to kill you, that actually you're supposed to give up your life rather than violate Shabbat. It doesn't become normative practice, but Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar held that way, that was the ruling, okay? That's totally one way that I think the Zakhor model would play out. The way you feel the weight of the Shamor model in rabbinic Judaism is we say very resolutely, no, people don't die for Shabbat. We don't let them just pick corn in the field, but if someone is sick in a deathly way, we do whatever we have to do to save them. And where does the Zakhor model come back in? All the interesting halachot, which people have different ways of dealing with and some keep in different kinds of ways, about not, even until today, engaging in certain kinds of healing that are not really life-threatening and that ultimately are about just giving you some sort of added measure of comfort to the extent it's something very significant, right? Many people who even until today, for a headache that's a little bit annoying, but is not going to lay them up in bed, they won't take an aspirin on Shabbat, okay? There's a lot of people who will, but what that spiritual practice is actually about is saying, within measure, not to the point where it's going to ruin my entire day, but within measure, I'm actually going to adopt a radical posture of humility with respect to my intervention in the world, even to the point that it creates some discomfort, okay? And on, we see this balancing over and over. I give you here on the last page, we won't do it inside, I want some time for questions. Over and over, we see the ways in which this balance is playing out. The fundamental categories, the famous 39 categories of labor that rabbinic sources anchor a lot of the discussion around melacha, about melacha around, those are actually just a description of the main office tasks of the ancient world. Okay? If that list were being written today, it would be typing, Xeroxing, we could go through the whole thing, turning on and off the lights, putting the heat on, etc., all of those things. It's just a list that other places in rabbinic literature that are not talking about Shabbat at all list off as the things that you do. Ben Zoma, when he's reflecting on how the world operates, gives the exact list that's later given in the Mishnah of Shabbat. So the whole category is actually anchored around what do people actually do for work, okay? But then the notion that we still forbid all kinds of small aspects of those activities, even if they're not plowing a whole field, but you're actually just plucking one item, those restrictions ultimately hark back to a Zakhor paradigm. Again, as I said to you, I think this is hard, and it demands a lot in a certain way, and there's a nuanced balancing that's going to tend to generate any number of various kinds of debates. But nonetheless, it is an attempt, and this is what I think actually the Rabbinic Project on some level does this writ large, but around Shabbat it certainly does it. It says, I refuse to not hear the full voice of the Torah. The whole process of midrash on some level writ large is that, which is to say, a rabbinic Jew is committed to hearing all parts of the Torah, including the parts that seem to conflict with one another, and to finding a way to actually be loyal to both of those values simultaneously. Okay, let's take a few questions, comments, and we'll play out the last bit of this. Any other thoughts, angles? Yes. Great. Okay, so you're raising. This is like for those who are familiar with it, it's the elephant in the room, and for those who are not, let me just give the quick update on this. So the normal way that in most rabbinic Jews today, when they hear Zakhor and Shamor as a trade-off, they think Zakhor is the positive commandments. It's things like making kiddush, it's having beautiful meals, it's saying the kinds of prayers that I have to say, and Shamor is the notion of the negative commandments and restrictions. And I've very much not been working with that model, right? I said to you I don't think it's even the words Zakhor and Shamor and the Mechilta that are being focused on. It's code for Ki Sheshet Yamim versus V'zacharta Ki Eved Hayita, 6 days of creation versus slavery. The question is how, if at all, that fits in here. So one thing I discovered, you quoted the Ramban, Nachmanides, as being a prominent view that articulates it that way. As far as I have found so far, though I would love to hear it, he is the first one to say it. The Talmud on Brachot Daf Kaf does say that there are two aspects of Shabbat, Shmirah and Zechirah, and it understands Shmirah to refer to the negative mitzvot, but their Zechirah does not refer to some whole set of positive mitzvot, it refers to Kiddush. Specifically, the rabbinic drasha, Zakhor et Yom HaShabbat HaKadsho, as being associated with mentioning Shabbat in a liturgical context. So I actually think that the Ramban sort of invents this notion of a whole sphere of positive and a whole sphere of negative. It's true that already in rabbinic sources, though I haven't found it back in the time of the Mechilta, but I think later among the Amoraim, building on the notion that the root shin mem resh is associated with negative, hishamer lecha, pen, all of those sorts of formulations that indicate don't do this, uses that phrase to sometimes be a catch-all from the negative mitzvot, and that would be operating on a different plane here. But that's again why I emphasize, I don't think Zakhor and Shamor here are actually those words themselves at all. It is actually about the paragraphs that they stand for, because that's what makes it really work with the Mechilta more broadly. Now you can say the positive and negative aspects of Shabbat trade off against each other. Part of what I think is powerful about this read is you see the other Second Temple Jews who are actually playing out Shabbat practices that are pulling apart at that synthesis. And that's part of what I think gives strong credence to the idea that what the Mechilta is doing here is, I see Jesus and I see the Dead Sea people. They're both wrong. Or more to the point, they're both only half right. And that actually we're trying to build something that does not have to abandon one paradigm in order to be true to the other. Part and parcel of my unwillingness to read Jesus as not being part of the Jewish conversation in this text is also wrapped up with, I don't think it's just like stam about him being compassionate. I think there is actually a reading here about Shabbat and what Shabbat demands, and to the extent that Shabbat does not demand something in my understanding, then my normal desire to be compassionate to a person would kick in, and it's in no way actually sort of hemmed in that way. Now, if you want to ask me from the Pharisees' sort of point of view in those texts, or from the Dead Sea community, why do they have no override in terms of, oh my God, like someone's dying? Like why should anyone have to ever die in the name of the law? Well, there I would say to you, and this is a whole other thing, I think maybe I taught this at Limmud once, but if not, it'll be good for a future session, which is the question of what are Jews willing to die for? And I would submit to you that everyone has something they are willing to die for, or ought to. And ultimately, the fact that something might kill someone does not automatically shut down the conversation about where that ranks on the hierarchy of values in terms of what's at stake. Obviously, we do that in war all the time. Something we feel to be a just war, we are comfortable. I don't mean comfortable like, yeah, no problem, but we are able on some level to process while still hanging on to our morality, unless you're really a pure pacifist, with the idea that there are certain things worth dying for. I think in that sense, right, on some level you could push the question further is, in a way you could, this is just really a question of why does Shabbat get the death penalty at all? Right? Meaning the Damascus document is not doing anything creative about seeing Shabbat as a capital level concern. That's the Torah, right? If anything, we're the ones who should ask ourselves, why don't we see it as a capital concern to the extent we try in some way to draw a line backwards from us to the Torah? That, I think, is a complicated question. I'll give you one thought on it, which I think sort of spills out as to why this is hugely important. Shabbat is impossible without group compliance. It is impossible. And if you want to now go deeper into sort of the biblical understanding of this, okay, what's the story, the sort of shocking story to us about Shabbat observance and capital punishment? The collector, the mikoshesh etzim. You read that story, you're coming along, it's Bamidbar, it kind of comes out of the blue, and there's this guy and he picks up some sticks of wood, and that's it, they stone him to death. Okay, now like to us who don't have that much capital punishment, who already have this different relationship with Shabbat of like why we don't get worked up on it that way, it's like this shocking, violent moment to many of us we don't understand. Okay? But I want to remind you the backdrop to that text, which is what is that man described as doing? He is a mikoshesh etzim. That verb appears only one other place in all of the Torah. And it is in Shmot Perek Hey, when Paro says to the people that they must go out, lekoshesh kash lateven. They must go out and gather straw to make the bricks. So what has this man done? After 10 plagues of finally overthrowing the regime that worked us day and night without ever having a day of rest, and after hearing with his own ear on Mount Sinai, in the stereo sound, V'zacharta ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim. Don't do malacha. We're not building that kind of society anymore. He goes out and gathers, is mikoshesh in the exact same way that brings back the ancien regime. And in that way, what does he do? He cuts the legs out of the entire communal project to actually create a safe space for people to say, I don't want to work today. That starts to sound a little more like a capital crime, okay? I'm not saying which of you would be comfortable throwing the first stone, but, to mix some of our texts here, but I also want us to imagine what it is to come out of a brutal regime of slavery that killed all of your firstborn sons, to finally have set up a powerful ritual response to that with enforced communal rest, and then have someone, before it's even gotten off the ground, undermine it. That actually, there are lives at stake in that equation. And in that sense, how that then sort of translates, I don't think we face the same struggle today. I'm not suggesting the capital punishment for the employer of that Christian woman, okay? But there is a way in which actually, even as it translates to a society where we don't, rabbinic and general society, where we don't execute people at the same level, which is overall a good thing, even in that society, recognizing that actually a tremendous amount is at stake with what we do as individuals on Shabbat, of what kind of reinforcement it does or doesn't create for other people to do the same. I leave this to you as a paradigm to think about. I hope, and my sincere hope is not only does this help unravel this Mechilta, but that again, as I started, in terms of the diverse practices and perspectives in this room, that you'll both stretch yourselves a little to hear the voice that maybe you're less inclined to hear and think about how it actually translates into your Shabbat practice. And when you do have points of conflict with other Jews around Shabbat, maybe you can hear a little echo of this ancient debate and not just stem a family conflict.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.